Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this evening's webinar, organised by the No to War, No to NATO network with support from the International Peace Bureau. Our subject this evening is very, very topical. NATO in crisis. Will Europe be complicit in Trump's crimes? This is also the first of a series of webinars that we're organising leading up to the NATO summit, which is taking place in Ankara this summer. So please do look out for our further discussions on NATO and our organising and campaigning against it. So we've called this discussion because it's clear that NATO has become a flashpoint for Trump's disordering of the world. He's giving his so-called allies in Europe a good kicking politically and economically. He's demanding vast sums are spent on weapons and war, preferably, of course, from US companies. And he's pushing these countries to support his latest criminal acts, notably, of course, not only other countries, but also now in Iran. Not all leaders of the European NATO states have the principles of the Spanish Prime Minister, who's called out genocide and opposed the war. Others embrace the war narrative and spend their national resources on killing instead of social spending and regenerating our societies and communities. So the questions we're hoping to address this evening are: how long will Europe go along with these terrible demands that are fragmenting our societies? Could this be the end of NATO? And what will come in its place if it does fragment in the way that some people expect it to do? And how do we prevent the development of an even more militarised pro-war Europe? And what kind of Europe would we like to see? And how could we achieve a society where security means meeting people's needs and ensuring peace, not military spending? So we've got a great panel this evening to discuss these questions. I'm very sorry to say that one of our speakers, that's Marga Ferre from Transform Europe and Europe of Citizens Foundation in Spain. She's been unable to join us because her plane time was changed. So she's actually in the air at the moment. So very sadly is unable to join us. And because of the late notification of that, unfortunately, we haven't been able to get another speaker in her place. But we still have three fantastic speakers.
I'm here.
We're going to hear from them very shortly. Just to say, though, that after the speakers have made their contributions, we will have plenty of time for questions and answers, discussion and so on. So when that time comes, you can either put your questions in the chat and I can present them to our speakers, or you can electronically raise your hand and I can call you to speak. Okay, so first of all, without further ado, let's turn to our first speaker and let's give a big welcome to Hans Hedrick from World Beyond War in Romania. Welcome, Hans. And unmute yourself, please.
So, hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
Yes? Okay. I don't hear you well, but anyway, okay. So I'm, okay. I will keep it short and crispy so we have more time for discussion instead of boring you with too much input. So I am a political scientist and environmental activist from Transylvania in Romania. And for 3-4 years now, I've got involved in the pacifist movement in my home country, and also trying to network abroad in Europe with other pacifist anti-environmentalist movement. So our webinar has three main questions. How long will Europe follow Trump, if this will be the end of NATO, and what to put in place of these scenarios? The first two questions are very hypothetical and speculative, with lots of unknown, and I prefer not to speak out there. Instead, I want to focus on question number 3, on alternatives to NATO, because that's what I have focused on as well during my last 2 years. More specifically, I'm a big fan of international law and history of international law. I've spent days and weeks in the Library of International Law at Munich University. That's my favorite place there. And I've written one scientific text and a shorter blog type of text about how to get out of the Ukraine war specifically. My attempt was to find a way out of the mental blockade that, in my opinion, exists in these protracted conflicts, like the Russia-Ukraine war, where there's an aggressor, Russia, and obviously, and a victim, and there's a mental blockade, generally speaking, in the public mind and in the mind of politicians, saying we cannot. It's morally not acceptable to negotiate a peace that is in favor of the aggressor state. Which, okay, this argument makes sense somehow, but it keeps mainly Ukraine in this loop, in this deadly loop in the ongoing conflict. So my attempt was to find a way out of this conflict, which is sound from an international law point of view as well. And digging through international law and history of international law, I elaborated a little scenario that centers around a European Peace Conference or a European Peace Congress. The good news is that that's nothing revolutionary, or we don't need to reinvent peacemaking in Europe, since Europe has not only a tradition in making war, but as well, there's a strong and old tradition of ending wars through multilateral and inclusive negotiations. These are the two key words, two key principles that should be applied to end these kind of hyper complicated conflicts. And again, multilateral and inclusive. What does it mean? Multilateral speaks for itself. It's not enough to have only the two belligerent countries at the negotiation table, like Russia and Ukraine, and maybe a mediator state like Turkey or Israel in 2022. But since we are all impacted by this conflict, many other countries should be at the negotiation table as well. Inclusive means you simply cannot exclude one key player or one belligerent party from the negotiations, as it has been tried during the peace, so-called Ukraine Peace Conference in Bürgenstock in Switzerland in 2024, when Russia was excluded. On the other hand, Trump tried to impose a peace treaty on Ukraine without having Ukraine at the negotiation table. He wanted only to negotiate with Russia. It doesn't work. Okay, so putting these two key elements together, multilateral and inclusive, actually requires to have a bigger peace conference, a bigger peace format organized. And looking into the institutional framework that we have on international level, international organizations, the good news is as well, we don't have to reinvent anything. We have the United Nations on the one hand, so they could, in theory, have, I don't know, a United Nations General Assembly resolution in the Uniting for Peace format, and asking for this kind of multilateral inclusive peace conference. Or even better, and that's my focus, let's reactivate the OSCE, which has been established as the CSCE, Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, in 1975 in Helsinki. And it's there, it's a full-fledged international, let's say, organization, which is as well flexible enough from its statute to allow for this kind of international or European peace conference. And more precisely, this peace conference could happen in the framework of a so-called OSCE summit of heads of states. There were approximately 10 summits of the CSCE and the OSCE, starting with 1975 in Helsinki, the last one being in Astana in Kazakhstan in 2010, when the heads of state of almost all participating states of the OSCE gathered in Astana. And at all these 10 or 11 summits of the CSCE and OSCE, there was always talk in the final documents, in the final declarations about the need of a common security architecture in the participating states, which include not only Europe, but the USA, Canada, as well as Russia and the former Soviet Union, and the countries from Central Asia, like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so on. So this could be a good format with 57 OSCE states to have a summit of heads of states, where the elephant in the room will be the common security architecture. And so then we simply have to face this leitmotif that of the OSCE, again, the common security architecture. You cannot exclude Russia, you cannot exclude the USA, you can't exclude Ukraine, obviously. So that's my argument. Let's push the heads of our governments, the ambassadors, the representatives of our countries at the OSCE, which has its headquarters in Vienna, to put an OSCE summit on the agenda. And maybe, I don't know, although the outlook isn't very good right now, but who knows, maybe the time will come that a consensus will build around this idea. And this could be a way out, to have an OSCE Peace Summit. Okay, I stop here. I'm very curious about your questions, and hopefully I can answer. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Hans. That's given us a lot of good thinking and ideas to get us started in this discussion. So it's a great pleasure now to welcome our next speaker, Heikki Patomäki. He is Professor of World Politics and Global Political Economy in Finland. Welcome, Heikki. Unmute yourself.
Thank you. I will share a few slides. Just a second. All right. So I try to answer the three questions in my own way, and the as I see NATO, it's a military alliance that has been shaped since the 1990s by expansion on the one hand, recently also by increasing militarization. There have been interventions, but also internal strain as well. Now, let's start with the Ukrainian conflict and the EU's role in it. Whether the EU is continuing to support the crimes of Trump. I think this is a slightly misleading way of putting the question. If you look at the Ukrainian conflict, it started actually with the economic policy and enlargement of the EU itself. And this was also based on the idea that the EU is some kind of a normative power, force of good in the world. And this actually triggered the Ukrainian crisis in 2013 and 14. There was this contestation over the association agreement, followed by Euromaidan. Yanukovych was forced to flee the country and so on. So the EU was very heavily involved at that time. If you look at the history since 2014 and 15, the EU has systematically pursued the expansion of NATO, and including also into Ukraine. Of course, in the Bucharest conference in 2008 or conference in 2008, where there was this declaration that Georgia and Ukraine will also, over time, join the NATO, the European countries were more hesitant than the United States. But since then, in the 2010s and 20s, I mean, the prevailing framing has involved the idea that all countries are, and they must be, free to join NATO or any military alliance if they so wish. And this has been the basis for NATO expansion as well. Now, different stories that actors tell are very much part of the conflict. And this is also true for the Russia-Ukrainian war. The European version of the story has been quite Manichaean, as is also, by the way, the Russian story, but in a very different way. Here, the story is that Russia is led by a dictator, Vladimir Putin, and Russia represents imperialism, a rather old-fashioned version of that, and is alone responsible for this unprovoked war. This war violates international law, and on the other side is Ukraine, that represents freedom and democracy, as well as courage and heroism. And particularly since the large-scale invasion started in 22, the EU and its key member states like France, Germany, and others and also outside the EU, the UK, have continued to resort or to maintain a strong commitment to military solutions. The idea being that the rule-based international order is non-negotiable. The rules are strict and absolute, so there can be no negotiations until Russia is out from the territories of Ukraine, or something along those lines. So that's the first point. The second concerns the recent decision by NATO to increase defense spending by a huge amount. Now the member countries are expected to spend 5% of their GDP on defense, including 1.5% on some broader security spending. But even the 3.5% is actually much more than what most countries, like 2 times or even 3 times in some cases, more than most of the European NATO countries used to spend on military. The appearance is that this happened on the request of Trump's demand in spring 25. But the question is whether this was only a matter of the EU's submission to the desires of the second administration by Trump. If you look at the evidence, the Defense Readiness 2030, which was preceded by ReArm EU program. This was actually developed many months before the June 25 NATO meeting. So the European Union has very actively been pursuing this kind of a line for future policies. Of course, the Trump second administration started in January 25, so there has been a lot of interaction, but nonetheless, I mean, there's a very active EU involvement as well. Moreover, on the basis of many statements by many leaders of both the European military personnel as well as by politicians, the EU seems to be actively, or the EU member states, seem to be actively preparing for a war with Russia. And the typical timeline is like 5 years. It's not that the EU is planning to attack or invade Russia. That's not the point. But they're expecting the conflict to escalate further, and they are expecting there to be further provocations or invasions by the Russians. The problem is that this is increasingly likely to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And there's a lot of evidence that the media and people and the politicians are perceiving many things that are happening. I mean, in terms of some sort of a cyber attack or hybrid warfare or something like that, and these perceptions resemble the waves of UFO, observations that have occurred time and again since the 1930s or whatever, through media influence. But anyways, the problem is that this is likely to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. There are tensions, however, within NATO. They don't stem so much from the attempt to increase defense spending, but rather they stem from other issues. These include Trump's promotion of and his government's promotion of the European far right, the US demands over Greenland, and also they are related to the end of the US financial support for Ukraine. The Europeans are now supposed to pay for the war, and the Europeans are still committed to military solutions. So obviously, I mean, this creates some kind of a strain between the European part of NATO and the United States. Now we have also the invasion of Iran, and the EU seems to be, at least indirectly or somewhat cautiously, supporting it. Just look at the recent G7 and EU statements. They're unilaterally targeting Iran, even though the war began with the illegal and unilateral attack on Iran by the US and Israel. I mean, that's unquestionable. And this fact is not even addressed in the statement, so they are very one-sided. Well, why are they then criticizing Iran? There's a reason why they're doing this. Iran has been carrying out attacks on third countries, but these third countries have US military bases on their territory, which are then used in the attacks or the invasion. And this is, of course, a problem for Iran. The prevailing interpretation of international law in this regard is rather one-sided, because in the fear of escalation of the conflict, there are restrictions on how you can even defend yourself in the case of such an invasion. And this prevailing interpretation, of course, favors very strongly militarily superior actors. I mean, the great powers or the superpowers of the world. The US being a case in point. It has hundreds of military bases around the world that it can use as a basis for invasion or some sort of attacks to other countries. Now, the problem from the European point of view is that the EU's selective response to the invasion of Iran further reinforces double standards in world politics. This has been a problem all along since the end of the Cold War and in the 1990s and 2000s, and this is also very much behind the escalation of conflict between Russia and the West. It's also partly behind the conflict between China and the United States as well. But anyway, as far as the European Union is concerned, this adherence to double standards clearly undermines also its own credibility. The problem is that these kinds of statements, they ignore causal processes. And this is the case both for the conflict in Ukraine and the invasion of Iran. There was a causal process, escalation of conflict that led to the invasion in 22, but the EU always sticks to the idea that it was unprovoked. There has been also a history to this conflict in Iran, and it has continued for many decades, and there have been all kinds of problems on both sides. But the problem here is that by ignoring these processes, you can stick to very strict and absolutist interpretation of rules and international law in some cases, and then ignore them in other cases. And I would argue that any legitimation of and support for the US-Israel invasion or invasions in plural, because this is not the first time, turns actually NATO in effect, not NATO being an actor here, but in effect, because these are NATO countries, and if the main European Union countries or the EU as a whole is also supporting, even if only indirectly, the United States in this regard, this turns NATO into more of an offensive than a defensive organization. Of course, some people argue that this has been a case for a long time. As far as the alternatives are concerned, I tend to agree with Hans.
You've had 12 minutes now.
Okay. That the alternatives are the traditional alternatives are the UN, the OSCE, and so on. Particularly these two. In the current context, where the Cold War, post-Cold War liberal euphoria has been replaced by polarization, disintegration, militarization, and some sort of regression, we still have to resort, however anachronistic the UN system may be, to its founding principles. Another equally important organization is the OSCE, and particularly the concept of common security here. However, these organizations are far from perfect, and they're at best only a temporary solution. And one of the key problems has been the veto power in the United Nations Security Council. And I think the second charter proposal that includes the idea that we can retain the veto power but create a procedure to overrule it is very much to the point. So if the Security Council's, this is the proposal basically, if the Security Council's permanent members cannot agree on a resolution, the General Assembly can overrule it, giving a qualified majority. Or alternatively, even better, if we democratize the UN system more, there could be a parliamentary assembly, and then there needs to be like a qualified majority in both of these bodies. However, I still think I didn't have the time to explain this, but I still think, and this is very much clear in my works, that if we want to achieve some sort of a sustainable peace in the longer run, the main focus should be on the governance of the world economy. And I think the best way of doing that is to develop global governance in terms of building various functions and powers of world statehood. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Heikki. That's really valuable, interesting, and very useful for us. I don't know if you've got any links that you could share in the chat, any links to your writings and so on that people could dip into. I think that would be very helpful. So,
yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And so turning now to our final speaker, it's lovely to welcome Sevim Dagdalen. Sevim is from Germany, of course, from Bündnis Wagenknecht, but for many years a parliamentarian in the German Bundestag, and of course well known to many of us as a really active anti-war and peace campaigner. So Sevim, over to you.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks to see you. Thanks for having me. First of all, maybe I have to admit that I see the NATO has never been a defensive alliance. And in my book, The NATO, A Reckoning with the Alliance, I'm proving it. In the current war with Iran now, there is a history of the de facto US support in the war of aggression alongside Israel against Iran. And by allowing the US, the use of US bases in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in Italy, Europe is already part of the war of this war of aggression against Iran. In addition, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, very intelligent person, has announced that a NATO coalition of the willing will keep the Strait of Hormuz open. It was just yesterday, I think. And for Europe, this war is becoming an existential question in light of rising energy prices. I mean, we do have already skyrocketing high energy prices. So the NATO has been pushed by the United States into an increasing state of overstretch. And internal contradictions are intensifying due to its global hegemonic ambitions in support of this US imperialism. And on the one hand, it seeks to wage proxy war against Russia. And on the other, it intervenes in the Middle East and mobilizes against China alongside Japan and South Korea. And this leads to the material exhaustion of European allies. And through the integration of NATO bases into US structures, such as the US air base Ramstein in Rheinland-Pfalz on German soil, NATO risks being placed on the front line of the war in the event of escalation, for example, through bomber operations launched from there. This is a very new report by the Wall Street Journals that from Italy, UK, and Germany, it's planned to launch the bombings against Iran. So this becomes more likely by the day as US can only make limited use of its aircraft carriers and bases in the Arab states. And since its founding, 1949, predictions of NATO's imminent end have been constant, always. And yet such claims by leading politicians like Macron or some others have served primarily to justify the expansion of military structures. And the facts are NATO states spent 1.6 trillion US dollars, more than ever before in history. Common funding has reached a record of 5.3 billion euros, the common funding. And NATO accounts for 55% of global military spending, a share that is rising following the decision to increase military expenditure to 5% of the GDP from last year in Netherlands in The Hague. And the internal contradictions, they do not slow NATO's global ambitions against China or its expansion toward Russia. This is one of the most important facts we have to see and we have to confront. The contradictions, they are there, but they do not slow the global ambitions of NATO against China and the expansion towards Russia. So the greater the overstretch, the more the myth of a community of shared values and defense is invoked. The more the overstretch, the more they say, we are a defensive alliance, we are an alliance of values for human rights, blah, blah. One for all for one is said to apply even to US and German support for Israel in the war in Gaza, as well as to the impunity of US elites for crimes suggested by the Epstein files, crimes that resemble the practices of Caligula more than those of a democratic rule of law state. So the US interventions in Venezuela, the threats against Iran and the war, and the blockade, the siege of Cuba, contradict the notion of a defensive alliance very clearly. The NATO, sometimes people say, is the NATO now in such a crisis that it will be the end? No. The NATO is an instrument of the United States. If the United States is in the end, okay. But it's an instrument of the United States. It's not an alliance, actually. And other NATO members are expected to participate in a new form of US colonialism, providing resources for economic warfare and proxy conflict against Russia. And despite cases like Greenland, where Europeans themselves risk becoming objects of geopolitical bargaining, many still believe their subordinate role guarantees security. Still, only a clear understanding of Henry Kissinger's words that the United States has interests, not allies, can open the way to insight. Anyone who believes that US missiles in Germany or elsewhere in Europe increase security appears to have lost all sense of reality. And for a growing number of people, NATO also means social hardship as a result of massive rearmament, what we are facing now in Germany, for example. And that's why it is time to pull the emergency brake on this train of the NATO, the largest military alliance pact, I would say, in the world, and get off. So Germany has to get out of NATO, and US troops has to get out of Germany. And today we mark 20 years ago, NATO launched its bombing campaign against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, beginning on 24th of March 1999 and lasting until June 1999. This war of aggression against Yugoslavia served as a blueprint for subsequent wars, whether conducted by coalitions of the willing among NATO states or by NATO itself. And as long as the United States exists and Europe continues to follow, NATO will persist. NATO is US policy. It turns Europe into an extension of American power. And the United States uses NATO to extract resources for the profits of its oligarchs, the US oligarchs, for example, by positioning itself as a dominant gas supplier to Europe and compelling greater European participation in US-led wars. What shall we do? I think the most important thing is at the moment to raise the attention and the awareness on the threat to the populations of Europe by the existence of the US military bases. The US military bases, they always said they are a guarantee for security for the populations of Europe. Whoever is having US A base or whatever, all the bases, military bases, and we have to say the NATO bases are the US bases. Nothing else. And now, since the war against Iran, we can see having a basis on your own soil is a risk for the security of the population. And in Germany, for example, I was 10 days ago, I think, close to the airbase Ramstein in the area, having some events. In the past, there was not so much support by the population for the goal of closing these bases and that the Yankees should go home and, like we say, Ami go home. But now everybody actually is supporting this this goal and this motto, this theme. because they say we do not want to be complicit in the crimes, in the war crimes of the US. And these are war crimes, what they're doing in Iran. And that's why people more and more are against this instruments of US imperialist politics, and also against the force of rearmament, and on the other hand side, cutting off the social welfare state, what we know, because more military expenditures, more money for like the 5% of the GDP, more money for military means less money for health, education, housing, and so on. And this is something people are getting more and more to know. They are more and more conscious about this serious existential threats, also because of the energy politics led by the US here in Germany and in some other European states. And that's why I really think that it's a good point in a way to organize, to open more this political room, ideological room for discussing and maybe organizing a movement on this thing against a basis, because we have to say we want to get out of the instruments of US war crimes. These are the spaces. We want to be more sovereign. Sovereignty for the people of Europe means out of our soil, that closing all these bases. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much indeed, Sevim. And of course, the question of bases, US bases, is something that we're extremely concerned about here in Britain, because
Absolutely.
not only the Prime Minister allowing US use of British bases, but also the fact that quite a few and many thousands of US troops at these bases, quite a few are more or less now US property, and the British government has no say whatsoever over what happens. And of course, they are being used extensively in the war on Iran. So this is a problem that so many of us in Europe are confronting. So thank you very much indeed for that contribution. So now we're going to questions from you, the audience. So I don't see any in the chat, but do feel free to put them in the chat. But I see we do have one hand. Oh, we've got a couple of few hands coming up there now. So I'll take first Les, followed by Isabel. And if you could keep your contribution to a couple of minutes each, then that'll give time for everyone to come in and for our speakers to contribute at the end. Les, over to you.
Okay, yes, thanks for the great talk. It's exactly what we need at this time. I want to suggest extending the argument that we've heard here. It's from Heike's talk, it's clear that the European members of NATO were planning a long-term war against Russia for many years, almost regardless of the USA. And now that the Trump regime is trying to withdraw its commitment, they're planning their own European version of NATO, less dependent or not dependent on the USA at all. I mean, and for militarizing everything, including the economy. So I want to ask, what are the political aims of that militarization, regardless of whether they call it NATO? And then as regards Iran, that's more uncertain, because there isn't yet a decision by the European members of NATO to join the Trump attack on Iran. And there's much reluctance because they see it as a suicide mission. And of course we should oppose it, but that may not be the main threat that we face. Although the conflict there is a threat to the whole world. But I'm wondering how you see the prospects then to oppose both, that is European involvement in the attack on Iran, as well as the more homegrown agenda for a long-term war against Russia.
Okay, thanks very much, Les. So our speakers will come back at the end, commenting and responding to any aspects that they wish to do so. So, Isabel, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I'm from the European Peace Project, also a board member of German Peace Council and the new initiative, European Transcontinental Initiative. And so I wanted to ask the questions about the role of Europe. I think we really have to redefine us as Europeans, like beyond the EU and for a multipolar world, and how we can co-create Europe beyond the EU and a multipolar world peacefully. So, of course, we have to get rid of NATO for that and all the US military bases and address but also kind of work together with BRICS, so build a neutral bridge, like Europe as a neutral bridge between East and West, and work together with the BRICS countries towards saving all the achievements we have in the UN Charter. Because what was addressed as the Western world order, it broke. It was said by many already on Davos, but it broke because of its own double standards. It was never what the UN Charter said, but it was like the West has more rights than the others, and it was just a mantle to cover up the interests which were pursued was brute force, and now kind of only this mantle is gone. So also I think what the first speaker said, the premise of aggressor and victim is false. Like in Ukraine, it's a proxy war of NATO against Russia. And if we want to solve this, we have to let go of all these prejudices. Like, we want a diplomatic solution, so everybody has to talk with everybody. And especially when there's a war going on and people even killing each other or seeing each other as enemies, it can only be solved in a dialogue. So we have to, first of all, also let go of all these enemy images. And I'm also sure that Russia is part of Europe, and I think it was also said in the first comment, OSCE is a good organization, but if we only kind of demand something from the EU governments, we're not getting anywhere, because we're already doing that since years, since decades. I think if you want to have something done, we need to do it ourselves. So how can we, as the peace-loving people, which are actually the sovereign, find what we want, a new security architecture for Europe, where it can be a neutral mediator between East and West and is not enemies with anyone, and is having the security architecture alongside or with Russia and not against Russia.
Thanks very much, Isabel. Thank you. That's brilliant. Next, Agneta, followed by Christine. Unmute.
Yes, I am unmuted, but do you hear me?
We do. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I'm Agneta Norberg, Women for Peace, and it has been a hard time to listen to in the beginning about the describing of how Russia just invaded Ukraine like this. That was not the cause. I think we should mention Victoria Nuland, the Biden's left hand, so to say. We have to mention Geoffrey Pyatt, ambassador of US in Ukraine, and of course Senator McCain, who were architects of how and the coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014. And it was the beginning, and the prime minister, he had to flee for his life to Moscow, because otherwise the Nazis, it's interesting, it's never mentioned that the Nazis took over Ukraine very early on after the Cold War ended, very early on, by the help of CIA. They were helpful all the time. So what I wanted to correct, what I found an historical wrong description about how the war in Ukraine started, because the eastern part, Donetsk and Lugansk, didn't want to belong to the Nazis in Kiev. They said, we want to be independent. And then the Azov Battalion, a Nazi organization, a Nazi war arm, the Azov Battalion, went in and killed 14,000 in Donetsk and Lugansk, the Donbass region. So that was a civil war for 8 years before the Russian, they asked for help because they are killing us. So Russia went in. So that's what I wanted to say. And also the Minsk conference in 2014-15, a peace conference in Minsk, and they decided a kind of independence, and they were allowed to speak Russian, because that's why the Azov Battalion was so upset that they wanted to speak Russian. So I think we have to set the history straight and right, otherwise we go wrong. So for me, it has meant extremely suffering. I was excluded from almost all peace organizations because I had the stomach to say this, and I was excluded, and I'm still excluded from 2 organizations. So, but I know what I know, and it's really, and one more thing.
Quickly.
What happened in Sweden is that Sweden applied for NATO, referring to the Russian threat in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Agneta. Now turning to Christine, followed by Tord.
Thank you. I'm from a Norwegian organization called Stop NATO. And thank you for the seminar, I must say. I really agree with the points that Sevim has put on the table. Especially, we are an activist organization, and we have been working also against US bases, of course. So I really support that we need to make better effort, all of us, against the bases. In Norway, there are 12. But I think also that the war in against Iran, the recent war, it has also showed that to have any foreign bases is a disaster. If you see, for instance, the discussion going on in the Peace Council of Cyprus right now, it is against the British bases, because to have foreign bases really shows that you lose your independence as a country. And you can't even decide your foreign policy anymore. So to use Cyprus and the British bases as an example is something that we can use in our daily struggle against the US bases. We also have a British base in Norway, to say that. And to point out also what the militarization does with the welfare conditions and social conditions, I agree on that. But I think that we will also need to put a little bit more effort, perhaps, in fighting against the nuclear armament as well, and especially the role that it has in NATO. And then I have a question to the 3 people at the start. How would you validate the different kinds of organizations within NATO and also with some countries outside of NATO? For instance, like the Coalition of the Willing and the Joint Expeditionary Force. And we also see that a lot of countries now, they go for bilateral agreements. It has been the case in Norway, where there are special agreements with Great Britain, with Canada, with Germany, for instance. How do you consider that in the whole contest.
Okay.
So that could be interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I can see 3 hands, and I'm going to take all 3 of you if you're super quick, because we're supposed to finish around 15:15. So, and we need time for our speakers to come back. So, if you could just keep under 2 minutes each, that'd be fantastic. So, Tord, there you are. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm from Friends of Sweden and also a board member of International Peace Bureau and the World Social Forum. I think this was an excellent combination of speakers. Combined, I think they give us the tool for going into a more winning mood. I've been especially selected for being in the International Peace Bureau because my background cooperating with farmers and the environmentalists. And what I see now is that everything is at stake. 1/3 of urea in the whole world, fertilizer, etc. The thing with the hormones is not only energy, it's about the food. And when we address such very basic things for people in common, and of course water is really the very extreme issue here as well, then we can reach out to people in common. And what we have here is a clear vision for the future, Hans-Erik, of course the US bases, but Heikki Patomäki, I think, pointed at the very necessity now to address the economic issue. The Bretton Woods institution is the reason why US accepted the United Nations. And we have to get all the single issue stupid new social movements who have been bound up in their silos to get out of it and start to address and attack the financial oligarchy, which are very much in the West. But as we know, there are some problems with also in Russia and China when it comes to the development of the models. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Tord. And then Karen.
Thank you. I just want to put forward John W. Burton, and he said that deterrence does not deter when human needs are frustrated. It gets to a point and there will be violence. And you have the security dilemma, which means there will be a constant race of arms, and also what Burton also showed is that you have there are similarities between the micro and macro levels. You can learn from conflict resolution at the micro level to the macro level. And GWAN, Global Women United for Peace Against NATO, will organize a webinar on the 2nd of May with David G. Dunn, who is knowledgeable about John W. Burton. So it will be about conflict resolution and prevention, and about Burton, and also Pamela Burton, the daughter of John Burton, will take part in this webinar on conflict resolution and peace. So I hope people will be interested in this. Common security was mentioned here, and the indivisible security goes very much alongside. And I'm glad the common security is discussed about, and I do hope that we will keep to that. We can't have security if not everyone is included.
Okay.
Also Russia in this case. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then finally to Ulla, and then we'll go back to our speakers. Over to you, Ulla.
Yes, thank you, Kate. I'm Ulla Klötzer from Women for Peace Finland, and also one of the initiative takers for Global Women for Peace United Against NATO, GWAN. And I want especially to thank Heikki, not because he is a Finn like me, but because he took up the financial aspect, which is really crucial. And I want to thank Sevim because you said about the US bases, we have to get them out. And because of the US bases, we today in Finland are changing our Nuclear Energy Act. Nuclear energy doesn't only mean new SMR reactors, it also means nuclear weapons on Finnish soil. It's opening up for it. And we have an international appeal. I put my email on the list soon on the chat. And we have already 10 international organizations and some 70 country-based organizations against this Nuclear Energy Act. We will send it to the Finnish government and the Finnish parliamentarians. But I think it's really important that we see that this Nuclear Energy Act in Finland opens up for nuclear arms, US nuke arms, and French nuclear arms, because France has said we can open up for 8 new countries for nuclear arms in Europe, and all the 4 Nordic countries are on that map. So we have to work against it, really, and we have to be strong, and we have to never give up. And I think this is a good start, this webinar, and we just have to go on. And I thank Christine from Norway for taking this up about the nuclear arms. So let's be strong.
Thanks, Ulla. You've often given me strength with your support when we've been working together. So thank you very much for that. Now I'm going to turn to our speakers. Hans, would you like to respond to anything that you've heard in discussion?
I will make 3-4 statements to respond to some comments that refer to my presentation. One, I completely agree with the history of the conflict in Ukraine. It's well documented. All this Nazi stuff, the CIA coup, Victoria Nuland, I completely agree. I didn't exclude intentionally this history of the conflict when I said that Russia is the aggressor. Russia is the aggressor from the international law point of view, since it infringed massively, openly against Article 2, paragraph 2.4 of the UN Charter, which is compulsory international law. It's jus cogens in international law. You simply cannot apply force against a country without the mandate of the Security Council. And unfortunately, it's not a valid argument to say that Russia came to the help of these independent republics in Donbass, since the same UN Charter, I hope you can still hear me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. The same UN Charter stipulates in Article 51 that members of the UN can make use of individual and collective self-defense. And the Donbass republics aren't part of the UN, okay? So it's very obvious, it's very easy, there's no way around. Despite the complicated history of this conflict, Russia is the aggressor, the same way as Israel and the US are now the aggressors in West Asia. Okay, second, I'll try to be brief. The coalition of the willing is a sign for me that there's no unity in NATO, and it undermines NATO, and it could lead to a split, whatever, in NATO. Then the European position towards the war in Iran, some bigger states, Germany, UK, France, they tried to stay out and nuance their positions. That's a sign of maturity and of realism. Hopefully they will stay on this position. Then what else? Germany leaving NATO and kicking out the Americans from German soil or from Europe. I'd completely agree. We should be sovereign as Europe, as even a Europe beyond the EU. However, it's more complicated. the role of NATO is not only to project US power worldwide, but also there's this famous saying of NATO having the role to keep the USA in Europe, the Russians out of Europe, and Germany down. So there's the German question out there. And the truth is that the European members of NATO were comfortable as well with the American presence in Germany and Europe, so that Germany doesn't become too dominant. Okay, so it's this should be addressed as well. Okay, how to keep the balance of power in Europe without NATO, without America? I'm sure we can do it, but there's this question out there, although not outspoken. There was one more question, but I forgot. If I remember, I will raise my hand. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Hans. Heikki, would you like to come in?
Yeah, sure. The first question was about the aims of militarization. Of course, obviously, I mean, military-industrial complex does exist. They are building one in the European Union at the moment, but there exists one in many European EU countries or European countries, including the UK, in the United States, in Russia and elsewhere. And so there are some economic interests and related interests that are going into this direction. However, I would like to stress the importance of people inadvertently developing an epistemic position where they only see these kinds of solutions as possible. I mean, they start to develop a particular narrative of the conflict and particular way of seeing the other and so on. And that has its own consequences, independently of any underlying interest whatsoever. The idea that the Ukrainian war is a proxy war of NATO against Russia, I find this interpretation slightly problematic for the same reason. It assumes too much on the side of intentions of the NATO countries. I think that the better way of putting this is to say that whether this was the intention or not, the Russo-Ukrainian war can be seen from the Western point of view as a war which is fought for the right of the countries to join NATO, the NATO to expand. So it's a war to support the NATO expansion. I mean that would be a kind of a right interpretation. So not assuming too much of intention. Of course, there are also other underlying issues, including also the more local security dilemmas in the eastern part of Ukraine, the divisions within the Ukrainian society. There are some similarities to what happened in Yugoslavia after the collapse of the federation and so on. But nonetheless, I think that we shouldn't overestimate the intentionality of the West to resort to some kind of a proxy war against Russia. Also, I think we shouldn't resort, and by we I mean the peace movement, resort to conspiracy theories or anything of that kind, or assume that any party in a conflict is simply telling the truth. So the Russian story is one story among the others. And the thing is that there are always various different contested and conflictual, contradictory stories in any conflict. The truth is not in the truth of any of these stories, but rather in the interactions of these stories and what kind of a dynamic they are actually generating. And the dynamic can be really destructive. And this is the problem that the European part or the Western part of the conflict has not been reflexive enough about the underlying assumptions of their own way of thinking about this conflict. And this has been a very strongly contributing factor in the conflict. But I mean, it is a different story than from the idea that it is simply some kind of a plan or deliberate intention on the side of the West to resort to war against Russia. The question about coalitions of the willing is complicated. I think that the coalitions of the willing can be also a force for good. When we are talking about the governance of the world economy or building these elements of world statehood, I think this is exactly what we need. We need coalitions of the willing of the progressive forces in the world. Whereas these coalitions of the willing within NATO very easily tend to support militarization, military solutions to various crises and conflicts and so on, and then they can be highly problematic. So it depends entirely on the context. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Finally, over to you, Sevim.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. I mean, since a good friend of mine, the Representative Thomas Massie in the United States, was able to force the government, the DOJ, to publish at least a little bit of the Epstein files. I'm very careful with the wording conspiracy theories because all the conspiracy theories proved to be very right. Let me tell you one thing, because of the, we have 4 years of Ukraine war and we are still discussing when did this war started? Was it provoked, not unprovoked? Is it illegal or not? One thing is very important. I think we should pay attention. Long before a war breaks out or starts, the truth is deliberately silenced to pave the way for it. So we, as peace-loving people, must do everything we can to help the truth regain its footing. Why I'm telling this? The New York Times reports that Israel, through the Mossad, helped instigate the violent unrest in Iran on January 8 and 9 this year, resulting in approximately 3,000 deaths, which was portrayed in the West as pro-democracy protests. And the goal was to create the impression of an imminent regime collapse and thus pursued Donald Trump to launch a military strike against Iran. Why I'm telling this? I'm telling this because when all the mainstream media was reporting this so-called pro-democracy protest, while the former CIA chief Pompeo stated publicly that he is greeting the protesters in Iran, within them, among them, CIA and Mossad, nobody paid attention to this. Everybody, even in the left or in the peace movement, they were totally in solidarity with these so-called pro-democracy protests, and were then criticizing the government, the Iranian government, for killing this figures 30,000 people or whatever. I'm just saying this because, as I said, since 4 years we are discussing Ukraine war. And I think we should get over it at the peace movement. This is one of the reasons why the peace movement didn't get great enough to be have an impact on all these war policies, these armament policies, because we are splitted, we are fragmented, we are having all these argues. And just one example. We have this Munich Security Conference of the NATO states every year in February in Munich, in Germany. And there are two big manifestations, rallies, because the two organizers are not coming on a consensus to say we are against the war. On the one hand, the one is accusing the other one to be not critical enough with the Ukraine war, with Russia. The other one is saying, oh, you are too woke, too much left, radicals, and so on. And I think this is one of the most weakest points of the peace movement everywhere when you look. And we have to unite again on one consensus. We have at least on one consensus against armament, against war crimes, against illegal wars like the one in Iran. And the other thing is, it was said with the basis, with the Cyprus basis and so on. I think we really have to work on this basis. because we have to make the differences. There are differences. For example, the bases of UK on Cyprus, they are not on European territory. It's extraterritorial territory. It's a sovereign base. It's different from the US air base Ramstein, for example, because this is German territory. And I think this is something we have to make more briefings or fact sheets for the whole worldwide peace movement. And in this structure of the US and NATO military bases in Europe, the relationship of absolute dominance is also reflected. This is why I say the most important NATO bases are simultaneously US bases embedded within NATO and Europe, while there are no NATO bases in the United States or Canada, for example. That's why they are unequal at all. And someone asked about the Germans. The Germans are totally relying on the US. I mean, we have a bilateral agreement now between the former Chancellor Olaf Scholz, but the current Chancellor Friedrich Merz and the government are following up this in stationing long-range missiles in this year on German soil, which can reach out Moscow in less than 5 minutes, long-range missiles. And they want to station it in Grafenwöhr in the south of Germany with the command center in Wiesbaden in Hessen. And the peace movement in Germany is against it, especially when you consider that the person who has the right to push the red button on these long-range missiles against Moscow is at the moment Donald Trump, and for the next 3 years. And this man is just going crazy at the moment. And that's why I don't think that there's any hope on this German government that they are getting more sane and changing the relationship. The other thing is, because of the economical problem in Germany, we are in a decline. We have since 2022, since the Ukraine war, the economy, we have a stagnation, and we are losing a lot of jobs, companies, and very much the major industry is in a decline. And with the Iran war now, more skyrocketing high energy prices. So the German government was already forced for a more pragmatic approach to China. When the German chancellor a few months ago visited China, it was less aggressive, more pragmatic. Let's do business. Try to avoid all the differences, all the critical points, and do some business. This is because it's existential now to get a good path to the BRICS states. And I agree on Isabel's proposal. We have to fight against these war policies, but also we have to try to get a own approach as peace movement, an own contact to the BRICS nations and to the peace movements there. And this is, I'm saying a few years ago, that we have to have more coordination with peace-loving people and forces in the BRICS states and the global south, because I think the hope is there in the global south, not in Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry to pester all the speakers about their time lengths, but unfortunately we've had a short webinar time. So big thank you to Hans, to Heikki, and to Sevim for really excellent contributions. And of course, thanks to you, the audience, participating and being with us. And of course, as always in our webinars, we welcome all anti-war and anti-NATO perspectives. So it's good to have you all here with us this evening. Please do, if you're not already signed up to both the No to War, No to NATO lists and the Guan lists, please do sign up and keep an eye out for what we've got coming up, and also, of course, prepare yourself for activities and actions at the time of the NATO summit in Turkey this summer. So thanks to Michelle for hosting, and thanks again to everyone for being here, and particularly to our speakers. Bye-bye.